In this lesson, we'll take a look at creating a quick still life with pastels. We'll start on canson mi-teintes paper, and I'm using a cooler gray toned surface. We'll start by lightly sketching out the shapes of each one of the apple pieces using a medium blue pastel pencil. At this stage in the drawing, we're just making loose marks, trying to find the overall contours of each one of the objects. We're not worried about details at this point. The details in this drawing will be implied details. In other words, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time refining each one of the details, but instead focus on allowing the relationships between the colors and the values to produce the illusion of details. We're creating fairly loose marks here with the pastel pencil, and in fact, most of the marks that we make throughout the drawing are fairly loose. This will keep the drawing feeling fresh, and it will actually help us from overworking areas within the drawing as well. It may seem a bit counterintuitive, but if we loosen up a little bit and allow our marks to be a little bit more free, it can actually lead to a more aesthetically successful drawing. All right, now that we've got the basic forms in place, we can go ahead and start defining some of the colors. Here I'm going to start with a dominant yellow-green, which will play an important role in the color scheme of the piece. These apples have a nice complementary color scheme inherently on them already with these yellow greens and these deeper reds. So we'll really play up this relationship. I also want to pull out hints of blue in areas as well. This is why I started with a blue pastel pencil. Once we have a little bit of the yellow-green in place, we can go back and start darkening up some of the shadowed areas. We're doing this initially because we can apply colors on top of this black application and make those colors really a darker value of the color itself, as these colors will mix with the black applications that we already have in place. Now that we have some of the black applications in place and we have some of the shapes of the shadows defined, we can go back with a deep red. And in many cases, we'll go right over the top of the black applications with the deep red. Here again, we're just establishing the strong color relationship between the yellow-green and the deeper red at this point. We're going to use a little bit of blending and smudging in areas, but to a minimal degree. For the most part, we're going to rely on the mixing that occurs when we layer colors over the top of previous applications. Now, as we continue to apply a variety of different reds and some deeper yellow-greens to the apples, it's important to point out that at this point in the drawing appears very messy. And it's at this point in the drawing that I think a lot of folks who are new to pastel give up and quit, because there definitely is a little bit control that's sacrificed here, especially in the early stages of the drawing. But you've got to recognize that working with a powdery material like pastel or charcoal is very similar to working with clay. When we work with clay, we start with a ball of clay, and the more we mold it and form it in our hands, the more it becomes what we're trying to create. The same thing's true with the pastels. The more that we apply applications of color and the color becomes more layered and has a bit more depth, the more control we seem to have over it and the more refined the drawing becomes. So we've added a little bit of flesh color to the apples, the parts that are exposed, and this color is actually a light orange. And then over the top, we're adding a very, very light yellow. It may appear that it's white, but it's almost a cream color. Our light source in this scene, of course, is originating from the lower left-hand corner of the picture plane. This is going to produce dominant areas of core shadow on the right side of the objects, but it's also going to produce areas of cast shadow. As we see here, there's a bit of cast shadow on the center apple. To address this, we'll add just a touch of black and then gently blend it in with our finger. We'll also add a few hints of light yellow-green inside of the core of the apple as well. There's more than just the flesh color. There are hints of the colors of the outside portions of the apples here as well. Now, we'll strengthen up some of the highlights that happen on the outside portions of the apple with a stronger and lighter yellow-green. Again, we're just going to touch areas where the light is the strongest, producing some more intense areas of color. And of course, to create a bit of harmony and unity, we'll also add this stronger and lighter yellow-green to all of the apples. Of course, one of the things that we want to make sure that we address is the contrast between values in the image. We're going to have adequate contrast and color with the reds and greens, but we need to make sure that we push the contrast and values far enough so that we have a defined light source. So in this case, I'm going to go back with a bit of burnt umber and darken up some of the shadowed areas. At this point, I want to shy away from using black too much because black can make an image appear flat. We'll also strengthen up some of the areas of color as well in areas where a bit of the tooth or texture of the paper is showing through a little too much. We do want some of the specks of the paper to show through in areas, however. We'll also use a brighter red, just as we used a brighter and lighter yellow-green to strengthen up some of the highlights. We'll use this brighter and stronger red to strengthen up some of the highlights in the areas of red on the apple as well. And just as we have throughout the drawing, we'll also use this color on all of the apples, again, to create a bit of harmony and unity. Of course, there are some locations on all of the apples where the light is hitting very intensely, and these are going to produce some areas of stronger highlight, more concentrated areas of highlight. So we'll use the cream and even a little bit of a light blue in areas to produce these locations of highlight. And then we'll continue to push the contrast in value. In this case, we're going to add a little bit of a stronger shadow behind our center apple, casting itself on the upper right-hand corner apple, again with just a touch of black, which is gently smudged into the surface, mixing with the red. Now we have our reds and greens that are contrasting each other nicely, but we're going to incorporate a third color to add a little bit of punch to the image. And as I mentioned before, we're going to pull out some blue. So I'll revisit some of the edges with the blue pastel pencil and some of the areas of shadow like behind the stems on each one of the apples that are still intact. We'll also use a much lighter light blue to establish the shapes of cast shadow. We want the cast shadows to feel nice and cool, so this initial application of blue should allow that to happen. We'll darken up some of the tones in a moment, but before we do that, we'll establish the color of the surface of the table. For this, we'll use a very light blue. This might almost look like it's white, but it has just a touch of blue in it as well. And of course, as we do so, we can clean up the edges around each one of the apples, basically defining them in space. So instead of using our initial marks to establish the edges of the apples, we're actually using the background applications to establish these edges. And you'll notice when we do this, the drawing starts to become a little bit cleaner and less messy. We'll add just a hint of purple in areas to the areas of cast shadow as well. This purple works nicely since we have some reds in place, and of course red and blue make purple. Now at this point I see that the center apple needs to be refined a little bit. We can see a little bit more of the edge, so I'll use a dark yellow-green to do so. And just as we've strengthened the contrast and value in other locations, we need to strengthen the areas of contrast in the cast shadow as well. So just a touch of black is used here, and then gently smudged with the finger to work it into the surface of the paper. Again, black is such a strong color, it's important to be very careful and use it sparingly in your drawings, as it can make a drawing look flat and unnatural. For this reason, we'll go back with our lighter blue that we used initially in the areas of shadow and kind of ease that transition from the darker tones of cast shadow to the lighter areas on the surface. This also, of course, allows us to get a little bit more of that added punch of color. To ease the transition of tone and value a little bit further, we'll revisit the outside section with our super light blue. Again, this may appear white, but it's actually a very light blue. And then, of course, we'll just blend a bit with our fingers to create a smoother transition. Now it's back with a sharpened blue pastel pencil, and we'll just define some of the edges even further and add a few more refinements to the edges of some of the apples. It may be tempting to reach for a black pastel at this point, but the blue does an adequate job of creating enough contrast, plus it has the added benefit of adding that additional color that we want in the piece anyway. Now, for the most part, our background color is just one color, our very light blue. So we're going to add a little bit of depth to that color by adding a very light yellow. Again, this is almost a light cream color. And we're just going to apply this color over the top of the background and just gently blend in areas, leaving most of the marks visible. Then we can darken up some of the details, or actually add some of the details on the inside portions of some of the apples. Here, a bit of burnt umber is used just to add a few indications of some seeds and maybe a bit of variation in the value. We'll also strengthen up some of the highlights. This time we're actually using a white pastel to do so, and we're just touching a couple of areas with this white pastel to make a few indications of some strong highlights. Again, just pushing the range of value even further and increasing the contrast, and thus the illusion of light. White is also applied to portions of the fleshy areas of the apple, again to add a little bit more variety, even though it's a subtle difference in value. Now we can strengthen up some of the greens a little bit further. Now this last touch of green here really pulls out that color combination between the yellow greens and the reds. This is a very, very light yellow green. It's almost a neon yellow green. But this strong color just added in areas makes a huge difference in making that color contrast a bit stronger. And of course we'll add it on all of the apples as well to ensure that we have harmony in the piece. And now our quick still life with pastels is complete.
If you enjoyed this video, then subscribe to the channel. And if you want to learn even more about drawing and painting, then check out our comprehensive membership program, which includes video courses, weekly live lessons, ebooks, lesson plans for teachers, and much, much more. To learn more about our program, just click on the link here or click on the card in the upper right-hand corner. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, thank you for allowing me to be part of your artistic journey.